Have you ever wondered how to create depth and distance in your landscape paintings, especially when you're painting mountains? Well, in this video I'm going to show you how. What we're painting here is a scene of Mt Talbot in southern New Zealand. It's a mountain landscape that I've painted many times, probably one of my most painted New Zealand landscapes. I just love this scene. It naturally forms a good composition, and it's a really good painting to create if you're struggling with creating distance in your paintings, struggling with things like understanding the tonal values, which are the lights and darks in the scene that you're painting, and even colour mixing as well. So I'm going to talk about all of this in this video. Now I'm painting on a 12" by 12" linen panel, and I'm sketching out the composition with burnt sienna mixed with a medium called pale drying gel. So this is a non-toxic medium, it's a thixotrophic gel and it helps to speed up the drying time as well, but the medium is derived from linseed oil. Now the first thing I do once I've sketched out my composition is I paint the dark values and shadows first. So the darkest values are going to be the rocks in the foreground, especially where the occlusion shadows are. Now I mix the colours of the rocks using burnt sienna, some ultramarine blue and a tiny bit of alizarin crimson, so this creates a near black. And then the next thing I want to do is paint all the other shadows in the distant mountains. So in the midground, those tonal values are starting to get lighter. This is because we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, and then as landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light, and this is because the value scale narrows, and this is really essential if we want to create depth and distance in our paintings. So I've used the same colours as I have for the rocks in the foreground, but I've just edged the mixture more on the blue side and also introduced titanium white. So we're just progressively lightening these shadow colours. Now by using the same colour combinations as well, it also helps to create the colour harmony in the painting, which means that the painting reads nicely to the viewer. The colours just look harmonious and like they belong together, and not garish and generally awful to look at. Now I'm using oil paints to paint this artwork, and the brand of paints I'm using is Blue Ridge oils, and if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. I always recommend using an artist quality oil, which Blue Ridge oils are most definitely an artist quality oil. You'll have a much better painting experience by using this, so I strongly advise not using student paints, as you just won't get the same coverage or depth of colour, and generally I found that student oil paints are pretty horrible to paint with. So always use an artist quality oil, even if you've never used oil paints in your life. So next, what we're doing here is, now we've got the darkest darks in the whole scene and it's built up the structure of what the landscape is going to be, I then start painting the areas in light. Incidentally, I'm also painting on a white canvas as well, so I can use the white of the canvas to gauge the darks off the white of the canvas. So again, it's going to make it a whole lot easier to initially create the depth and distance in the painting, and then when we start adding the areas in light and mixing those colours, it makes it much easier to get the saturation of the colours correct. Now we're going to find our most saturated colours in the foreground, especially in these greens here. So there's a whole mix of grass and other mountain vegetation there, some of it a bit pale in colour, some of it quite high in chroma or saturation, especially the grass. When it comes to mixing the grass, for the foreground anyway, I use yellow ochre with cadmium yellow medium and ultramarine blue and titanium white, and that's the base of my greens there. And then I adjust the greens by mixing in either some cadmium red or some alizarin crimson. This is going to help to desaturate the green a little bit, but also those colour opposites, red being opposite to green on the colour wheel, it's just going to add more harmony to the green and make it look a lot more natural. And then we can do things like mixing in either a cobalt teal or a phthalo green in order to make the grass a little more saturated and shift the hue of the grass so we get some emerald tones in there. Now I'm trying to cover ground quickly here in this mountain landscape, so I'm using large brushes, mostly number 5 and number 6 bristle flat brushes. These brushes are made by Rosemary & Co, and if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. I've been using Rosemary & Co brushes for years, they're just awesome to paint with. So what I've done next is I've painted the snow on the mountains, and then the sky and the clouds. Now the thing when you're painting snow on mountains is you actually want to keep the value of the snow a bit darker to start with. So we're not going to just use straight titanium white from the tube. We want to make it a little darker so we can actually just add in some of the shadow mix into the snow. Now the reason being is because we're going to save our lightest lights for the end of the painting. So this is what's really going to make the painting pop. So we'll do the same with the snow. We'll just add our lightest lights right at the end of it. For the clouds I'm able to use a similar colour, so mostly titanium white with a little burnt sienna mixed in, and then I allow the shadow mix to mix in with that. Now coming back to the foreground here, and I'm painting the water. That's also got a lot of highlights on it, some sparkling water and just water from the rapid pace of the water as it flows around the rocks and creates turbulent water. Now for the water I've mixed mainly ultramarine blue with some titanium white, a tiny bit of yellow ochre, and then also some phthalo green in there as well, so we got a nice greenish looking blue. Next I'm starting to add some more details to the rocks. I've painted the highlights on the rocks using the same colours that I've used in the shadows of the mountains and even the shadows of the rocks. So it's ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson, but it's the titanium white and the burnt sienna that are the most dominant colours. So the value of the highlights on the rocks and stones is much lighter. Now whenever I paint an artwork, I'm always thinking in terms of value, i.e. how light or dark the subject that I'm painting or the element or whatever it is. So for example, these trees here that I'm painting in the midground are quite a bit darker in value. This is because trees are some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape, whereas something like the ground plane, such as the grass for example, is usually much lighter. John Carlson said this in his book Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, that the arch of the sky is some of the lightest values in the landscape, along with the ground planes or the grass. Then the slanting planes of the mountains are getting darker in value, and then the upright planes, which are the trees, are the darkest values in the landscape. Now at this point in the painting I'd got the block-in stage roughly established and the painting had dried, so I was able to start bringing in some details. So first of all I wanted to start painting in the details of some of these rocks here, and I was using a number 3 synthetic flat brush to start adding in more rocks, and then I can add highlights to them a bit later on. Now as I said, the blocking in start of the painting was complete and I'd allowed it to dry, so this is where I begin the modelling stage of the painting, which is where we're working the individual zones and just starting to get the overall forms of the various elements within the painting. We're adding more paint layers here and also beginning to add some details. Now one of the things I'm doing as well is I'm just adjusting the shadows and just defining the mountain more, but with the areas that are in light, I'm also progressively adding lighter layers of paint, so I'm building up to those lightest layers, and this is how we can create real detail and depth in our paintings. So for example here, I'm just painting the suggestions of the cracks and fissures in the rock face of this huge mountain here. The mountain naturally stands at over 2,000 meters high, so it's a big mountain. But this part of it's in shadow and I'm just painting the suggestion of deep cracks in there, some deeper shadows, and then some reflected light as well. And then also there's some shadows to be added to the upper part of the mountain that's in the sunlight. Now along with that I added some fresh layers of paint to the sky and clouds. The sky is a mix of ultramarine blue with just a little bit of cobalt teal and some titanium white. You could also use phthalo green instead of cobalt teal. It's just to add a slight green element to the sky. And then what I'm doing here is I'm just adding some highlight to the areas of the mountain that's in light, so these sheer rock faces. And I actually found that an 1/8 of an inch bristle dagger brush was really good for painting some of these highlights on the rock faces. Now what I'm doing here now is adding some more layers to the snow, but I'm making sure that I'm not using my lightest lights just yet. So I've still darkened the value of the snow a little bit by mixing in some of the mountain shadow mix into it. However, the white paint that I've used is lighter than the previous layer. I also applied the paint with a number 3 synthetic flat brush. So I'm really starting to get in some detail here. I've feathered some of the edges of the clouds just to make them look more interesting, and I'm starting to paint a lot more details. So the background mountain is really coming a long way and actually is almost complete. There's just a few more highlights to be added at the end of the painting, but I'll wait until it's dry. So now I'm working on the midground and just painting the suggestion of some details. I'm starting to use more of the synthetic flat brushes for that finer detail rather than bristle brushes. Generally I use the bristle brushes at the beginning of the painting when I'm blocking in, so I've got that loose brushwork and it's going to create some nice vitality and energy within the painting, so it's just going to make it look alive. And after that you can go as loose or as detailed as you like with your paintings, but I'm adding a bit more detail in this painting here. So the next thing I'm doing is I'm restating some of these darks within the forest that's in the midground here. I'm keeping in mind that trees are some of the darkest values in the landscape, and I'm using a mix of ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre and just a little bit of titanium white. Now I've found that a bristle flat brush is really good for painting these tree shadows. And then I'm just adding more detail and just tidying up areas within the foreground and just building up those layers. Also things like just adding a bit of a red element to the grass just to break up the green of the grass and add a colour opposite. So it's a green where I've mixed a little bit more cadmium red light and some titanium white. Now if you're struggling with your paintings and struggling to create depth and distance, struggling with the values and the colour mixing, then let me help you. I'd love for you to be able to create your best artworks and be able to create paintings that you'd imagine that you're really proud of, and even be able to create paintings that are at a standard that you'd be able to sell them. So I'm giving away a free landscape painting blueprint that's going to give you all the fundamentals of painting landscapes such as this mountain landscape, and it's going to help you to improve your painting skills. If you'd like this, just click the link below and I'll send it over to you. Now at this stage we're at the point in the painting where I've been adding a lot of detail in the midground and then progressively adding more lighter layers of paint, so some highlights to some of these trees and bushes in the midground, also the same for the grass. And I'm getting into a lot more detail. For example, I'm painting these rocks here and just adding lighter layers of paint, again using a number 3 synthetic flat brush. I'm still using a similar mix of titanium white with a bit of burnt sienna, a tiny bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of alizarin crimson. I could even add some yellow tones in there by just mixing in a small amount of yellow ochre. Generally these rocks are a low chroma colour, so I use my earth colours mainly to paint these. And then there's little things just like painting some reflected light in the side of these rocks just to make them look more interesting and more realistic. But now at this point I'm really getting into the details, especially in the foreground, and I'm thinking about getting this painting finished. So things like the toy grass, which is this yellow looking grass here, or at least the floral parts of it, but it's very common in these types of New Zealand mountain landscapes. And following that I'm just continuing to add highlights to the trees and bushes, and this is where I'm saving my lightest values towards the end. As I say, I'm just building up those lighter layers of paint. There's things like adding a little details to these grasses here in the foreground, painting these strap-like leaves, and I'm using a number 0 synthetic rigger brush. Now it's gotten to the point of the painting where I'm going to be finishing it, and I'm now adding my lightest layers of paint. So for example, adding the lightest layers of paint to the snow in the upper part of this mountain. And this I used a mix of titanium white with just a little bit of cadmium yellow. The next thing was to paint the sparkling water. So I used that same paint mix that I used for the snow in the upper part of the mountain to paint lots of little dots using a number 0 synthetic rigger brush. And these dots make the water look like it's shimmering in the sun. It's a really cool effect that you can do with water to create sparkling water, and it really adds a lot of depth in your paintings. At this point now I'm just finishing the painting up by just adding a few last highlights. Now if you want to learn to paint sparkling water, then check out this video here.